Today I'm finally dedicating a video to why sand is a bad reptile substrate by responding to the 10 most popular arguments from people that use it, including sand is only bad if your husbandry is wrong. Many animals are naturally on sand. Many animals have done really well on sand. My animal's on sand and has no signs of impaction, but I'll move it off the sand if it starts to show those signs. Only calcium sand is bad, other types of sand are okay. Reptiles won't get impaction if you tong feed them, bowl feed them, or have a non-sand area where they can eat. It's fine if you take your snake out of the enclosure to feed it. Coarse sand is bad, very fine sand is okay. Sand mixes are fine, like coconut fiber and sand. And you need sand for bioactive enclosures. Sand is this product that's marketed to animals all the time from pretty much every big company, and it says it's perfect for just about every animal on planet Earth, as pretty much every package does at this point, and they never mention impaction, which in context to sand and animals is when one of an animal's organs or guts or intestinal tracts are completely clogged up to the point that nothing can pass. Once an animal is impacted, it is extremely hard to get it through them and get them to actually clear it out so that they can continue to eat or pass waste or anything, and it pretty much always leads to death once it gets too bad. Impaction doesn't just come from sand. They can be impacted from consuming too much of just about anything. Too many of hard exoskeletons from insects has caused impaction before, and accidentally eating large quantities of other types of substrate has also led to this. For example, animals have been impacted by things like coconut fiber before, but it's a lot more rare because it can be broken down by the animal since it's not the same material as sand. Sand is usually made from quartz or other very hard materials that can technically be broken down by stomach acids over time, but it takes a super long time. Take coconut fiber for example, it literally comes from coconuts. Say even aspen or something. Aspen is a soft wood substrate. Both of these materials are a lot softer, and although they shouldn't really be digested, they can actually be digested in very small quantities because they're softer and break down more quickly. Sand on the other hand is super hard and does not exactly break down the same way. Another reason that impaction happens so frequently with sand is think about how sand actually acts. When it's dry, it's very soft, it just runs through your fingers, and it's pretty messy. But as soon as you add water, it starts to stick together and glob up into a material that you can actually mold and hold in your hand. And this is basically what happens inside an animal's stomach. It's dry on the surface, the animal somehow ingests it, it goes into its mouth and down its throat, and all of those moistures, the saliva, the stomach acids, and anything, the mucuses lining its body, all of that stuff is going to absorb within the sand and make it stick. And once it sticks, it's pretty stuck. There are ways to try and alleviate impaction. Both the DIY methods at home and veterinarians can go in and literally just cut your animal open and take the sand out, but this is extremely invasive. Doing surgery on reptiles is extremely expensive, and they're very small animals, so putting any small animal on anesthesia is a pretty high risk for death. For that reason, you should hopefully try and avoid impaction. But there are tons of people who say that impaction does not have to be caused by sand, and we can now get into those 10 arguments. Let's start with the first argument, which is probably the most popular one I see, and that is an animal will only get impacted if your husbandry is incorrect. Now, first I'm going to talk about this, assuming that this is true. Because reptiles aren't extremely popular, it's really hard to find actual convincing evidence of these things. But again, let's talk about this, assuming this is actually what's true. So when we talk about incorrect husbandry, we're talking about how you care for an animal and what you're doing wrong that may lead to problems with their quality of life and their lifespan. For example, I keep my leopard geckos at 90 degrees in their hot spot, which is the area that they can go to if they get cold. They can warm up here. We use heat mats and heat tape so that they can heat their bellies up. And it's also widely known that leopard geckos do the best when they have under tank heating instead of overheating. Although heating above them can work, leopard geckos seem to digest food best when they have that warmth beneath them. The temperature is just right for their tummy to help break down and pass those materials through their body. And let's say somebody has their temperature at 85 degrees instead of 90. This is a number I made up since, again, there's not much hard evidence to convince me one way or the other of what the actual number would be. But let's say this 5-degree difference from 90 degrees down to 85 is the variable that can potentially give your animal impaction. It's just 5 degrees too cold, and the animal is going to have trouble passing a little bit of sand that builds up in it over time. Well, let's think about the other issues with that 5-degree difference. maybe the animal would be just a tiny bit less comfortable at 85 versus 90, but most likely a leopard gecko wouldn't even think about that. They don't think of the potential of, oh, I wish I was 5 degrees warmer. They just find the warmest spot. And let's say it does take them just a little bit longer to digest foods on that 85-degree hotspot than the 90-degree hotspot. Overall, it's not big changes, and it's not really that important, except for when it comes to impaction. If the only danger in having a 5-degree too cool of a hotspot is an animal potentially gets impacted, I see it as a lot easier to just change the substrate out with something that has very low chances of impaction. Like tile, for example, which we really like to use now. Tile doesn't peel up, there's no part of it they can eat. Paper towel, theoretically they could take a bite of it, but most likely they wouldn't, and they're not going to ingest any of it. But then meanwhile, sand, maybe they will start to ingest little bits, which we'll get into how they would do this and why, and then they get impacted because your temperature is just 5 degrees too low. And this could go with any variable. For another example, let's switch to Kenyan sand boas, which they literally have sand in their name. Let's say humidity is the variable that affects whether they get impacted or not from the sand. If your humidity is way too high for a sand boa, you may see scale rot starting to develop. Your animal may develop a respiratory infection because it's just not the right amount of moisture in the air. But let's say it's just a minor humidity difference of just a few percent, maybe 5, 10, or 15%. 10% off won't really affect anything else. But if this is the variable that can risk your animal getting impaction, and there's no other risks to that 10% difference, it would be so much easier just to take the sand out. So why not just do that? And then if your counter argument to that is, well, it has to be that big difference. It has to be a 20-degree difference, or it has to be a 50% humidity difference, or something like that. Well, your animal's going to show a lot of other issues other than just impaction, because we've gotten very healthy animals that show no signs of poor humidity, no signs of incorrect temperatures, and yet they still come impacted because they were on sand, most frequently with leopard geckos. And you can find images of this. The animal looks healthy, except for the fact that it's impacted. So logically, it would make sense for it to show signs of other issues other than just impaction if it was those extreme differences in husbandry that actually gave them impaction. Well, animals are naturally on sand. For example, leopard geckos. This is the most common animal that I hear is naturally on sand, and this one's just not correct. They're from Afghanistan, and although I'm sure there's sand in the environment, sand is all over the place. Keeping a leopard gecko straight on 100% sand is different than a leopard gecko that is in an environment with maybe 5% of the substrate being sand. For leopard geckos specifically, their substrate in the wild is mostly very rocky stuff, which is oddly similar to tile. Or let's go to an animal that is actually on sand. For example, back to sand boas. They bury in sand, believe it or not. And sand for certain species are a much bigger part of the environment. Well, you have to keep in mind, there is a reason that almost every species of animal lives longer in captivity with good husbandry than it does in the wild. You can remove risks and decrease risks. For example, there's no predators in an enclosure. Hopefully. Meanwhile, there are predators outside. Snakes are a big source of food for many birds of prey, but you likely don't have any birds of prey in your enclosure, so the likelihood of your snake dying from a bird eating it is very low. And then in comparison, look at sand, for example. Just because animals are on sand naturally doesn't mean the occasional animal does not get impacted from said sand. Again, this is another thing that has not much research and not much evidence around it, because it's just not quite a big enough thing for people to research and study and make budgets for when they go out on these big research studies in different environments for different animals. But those are the things to keep in mind when someone says that because an animal's naturally on something or naturally doing something, then that automatically means it's the right thing. Because that's not true. We've seen many examples of animals in captivity that have different care or different setups than they would naturally, and yet they still live for longer than they would in the wild. Well, many animals have done well on sand. Like I've heard of leopard geckos that lived their full 15, 20 plus years and they lived on sand forever. So what about those? Well, just because you keep your animal on sand doesn't give you a 100% chance of it getting impaction. If I were to take a completely random guess off the top of my head, I would say it's the minority of animals that would actually get impacted. Less than 50%. Whether it's 5% or 45%, I'm not sure, but I do think it would be the minority of them. With that said, I don't see the point in risking it if there is that chance. Again, not everything is going to be perfect in an enclosure. Teeny tiny variables that make a 1% difference in the likelihood of your animal getting sick or getting hurt, in the grand scheme of things, doesn't make a big difference, especially if it takes a lot of work to make those changes. But in the case of sand, it's literally just taking it out and putting one of your many other substrate options, and that's a huge risk decreased. So I just totally believe it. There are plenty of animals that have done amazing on sand, but that doesn't mean they're all gonna do well. Well, my animal's been on sand and it looks completely fine, but if it starts to show signs of impaction, I will happily move it off as soon as I notice it. And this is great, it's good that you are a proactive keeper, but the signs of impaction are pretty minimal. You may start to see slight growth in their stomach. And with leopard geckos, for example, because their bellies are so thin and so see-through, you can actually often see the sand using a flashlight or even just your bare eye. Say they're on black sand, if you see a large black mass that wasn't there before, it's probably sand. And the thing is, sand can often build up over time, and it can be a very gradual thing. But in the many cases that you can find online with different pictures and stuff, and with the animals that we've gotten in here that show signs of impaction, it's always too late for them because it's built up so much. Just because you see a sign of impaction doesn't mean there's time to fix it. And more likely than not, seeing a sign of impaction is a sign that it's too late, which is why I think you should be proactive and remove it before those signs even show up. But again, maybe your animal would do perfectly fine on the sand. That's not a risk that I recommend that you take. Well, only calcium sand is bad when the other sands are fine. Calcium sand is made from calcium carbonate and it's crushed up and put in a bag for your animal. The reason calcium sand exists is because many animals benefit from calcium supplements in captivity, which can help increase its lifespan and quality of life. And so companies were like, oh, well, we can make this substrate out of calcium and they'll never have too little of it. But you can have too much calcium as well, and that is dangerous too. Also, the other ironic thing about calcium sand is even though it's made to be ingested, it still impacts like other substrates. It still sticks together and it can still get clogged in their gut. And it's so condensed and so strong that it often builds up faster than the animal can actually break it down. So calcium sand, yes, is also bad, and most often worse than other sands because it actually encourages the reptiles to consume it, when fine sand might just accidentally be consumed. Will I tong feed my animal or I bowl feed my animal in an area of the enclosure that does not have sand? Tong feeding is when you use tongs or some sort of holding device, even just your hand, to hold an insect, for example, with insectivores, or to hold a leaf or some type of vegetable for herbivores, and this allows them to eat above the sand. So say you throw a bunch of insects in an enclosure and your animal starts eating them, they're probably going to accidentally grab some substrate here and there and it starts to build up inside of them. But tong feeding takes this risk away. Well, the thing about this is eating is not the only time an animal ingests their substrate. Pretty much every reptile uses their tongue to see what's around them. You see animals licking stuff all the time. Leopard geckos, for example, they'll just walk around and they'll be licking everything. Bearded dragons do the same thing. Snakes also lick all the time, but the difference is snakes' tongues are pretty dry and sand doesn't really stick to their tongue. Even if it did, when it goes in their mouth, it would probably fall right off. So snakes are the one example where it probably will not ingest sand, just living in an enclosure with sand. But we'll get to snakes in a minute. Lizards, on the other hand, are going to be licking, and even if they just get a couple grains here and there, it's likely going to stick and not always pass through them. So when they're simply exploring or scavenging or just walking around, they're very likely consuming small amounts of sand. So yeah, tongue feeding is great and bowl feeding is great, and it's usually recommended. It's also great enrichment for you and the animal, and it definitely would decrease the likelihood of impaction, but that risk is still there, and for me, the risk is still too big. And then with snakes, well, snakes aren't going to be licking their substrate and ingesting the sand, and you can just take them out of the enclosure to feed them. This is also true, and this is actually the most likely scenario where sand would be okay, where you take your snake out to feed it. And the likelihood of impaction is extremely low and probably close to zero. But of course, another problem arises, and that is whether you should take your snake out to feed it or not. I have a very old video where I am a lot more nervous on camera. You can check it out if you want. It's called Should You Feed Your Snakes in Their Enclosure, My short answer is yes, you should feed them in the enclosure and you should not take them out of the enclosure. A very short summary of this is 1, when your snake is eating and done eating, it's going to be a lot more worried because it's going to have trouble defending itself with such a huge meal inside of it. For this reason, there's a high likelihood the snake will regurgitate or vomit that meal once you try and put the snake back in its enclosure. The second issue is taking your snake out to feed it decreases the likelihood of them actually eating because they're in what might feel like an unsafe environment to them and they could simply refuse the food. Third, what people do in this case is they leave the snake out in a separate tub overnight so that they can actually relax, start to digest, and then put it back in the morning or the next day to ensure the snake is calmed down. The problem with this, similar with leopard geckos, is they need to be in their proper setups to digest their food efficiently and the most comfortably. But if you put them in a tub or something overnight, they're going to be in a different environment that might not be ideal for them to start digesting their meal. Theoretically, you could set up a whole second enclosure without sand, but you might as well just have that be the first enclosure in the first place. Again, you can check out that older video I did with more reasons as to why you should not take your snake out to feed. Well, very fine sand is okay to use, but coarse sand should be avoided. This is another argument, although a lot less common, but all sand acts the same. Although coarse sand is more likely to stick and clump up, especially even in amphibians. For example, axolotls can even be impacted if the sand is too coarse. Meanwhile, fine sand works pretty well with axolotls. Now, I don't know a ton about axolotls, and I won't go into the details of that, but you can find info elsewhere where it's proven that axolotls can do fine on the right types of sand. But reptiles, it's back to just simply what we've seen and what's happened, where any type of sand, whether it's fine play sand or more coarse types of sand, all have that risk of impaction. Again, the risk is probably a bit lower with the fine sand, but it still clumps together just like any other sand would. Well, sand mixes are fine, and you need sand for bioactivity. We can knock these both out at the same time. You do not need sand for bioactivity. Bioactivity is where an enclosure is more self-sustaining and like an ecosystem where there's little bugs in your substrate, most commonly springtails and isopods, and these eat away at the waste. You also normally have plants in a bioactive setup, and plants need their own mix of substrate. I certainly don't know much about keeping plants alive, but with that said, certain plants need certain things in the substrate to keep them alive. But there are many plant options that do not need sand, and insects that you use for bioactivity don't really need sand at all. We sell springtails and isopods, and we use cool mixes as well. We normally do coconut fiber with charcoal and sphagnum moss and maybe even some cypress mulch or something like that. And other people use many other products, and most often sand is mixed into it. But I've had bioactive enclosures for years now, and they don't have sand in them because sand really doesn't do a ton for the bioactivity, and there are many ways to successfully set up a bioactive enclosure without it. And then the second argument is that sand mixes are okay. If sand's just mixed in with something else, there's a small enough amount that it won't really affect the animal. This is true as well. It highly decreases the likelihood, but again, I would just leave it out. I don't see a point in adding it when there's really not much benefit. They do help animals burrow. For example, savanna monitors are often kept on a sand mix where they can more easily burrow in the substrate, but I think that you can make burrowing substrates without that sand just fine. So is it the end of the world if you put sand in the substrate mix? Probably not, but I would just leave it out. And those are the 10 most common arguments for using sand in reptile enclosures, and my responses to all of them. If you have other arguments you've heard or seen or whatever, leave them in the comments, and maybe I'll make a pinned comment where I'll leave my responses. Again, it's not instantly the end of the world if your animal is on sand. I had my first leopard gecko on sand for a period of time, and he was on it for a short enough amount that nothing really happened. Also, sand just looks ugly in my opinion, and the colored sands even stain reptiles. My yellow leopard gecko's feet turned black. We had a bearded dragon to get shipped to us, and it was almost completely pink from the pink sand it was on. So I've finally created a piece of content as to why sand is not a great reptile substrate and why I suggest against it. Check out my other videos if you want reptile stuff, usually reptile stuff, and feel free to leave a comment. Maybe I'll even read it. Maybe. No promises. with other videos you'd like to see, and other simple reptile topics that I have not covered or that I've covered in the past that you want me to talk about again. If you want to support my videos, you can do so through Patreon. You can buy a hoodie or a t-shirt or something, and you can check out Emerald Scales, where we sell animals and insects. So I guess insects are animals, but yeah. Okay, that's it for this video. I'm Alex, and thanks for watching.